The first book that I've chosen to represent my development as in the identity of a reader is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is the first book that I remember my parents reading aloud to me. My parents focused a lot on more complicated books, I think partly for their own interest. I know that The Hobbit wasn't the first book that they read to me. They also read to me C.S. Lewis's The Space Trilogy at some point, and the first book that was ever read to me was something that my dad needed to read for class, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. But that also explains a lot about me. The Hobbit was the one that I remember getting involved in the story of. I think I was excited by it, and above all, it was a social experience. Like I wanted to be I viewed it was somewhat like a discussion between me and my parents. I was interested in the story, but I just liked my parents reading to me, paying attention, and I think that had a lot in developing reading as a positive and exciting thing. And then I was sharing that with my parents because I think my parents were also really interested in the book. It was very important to me. I didn't understand all of it, and I don't remember all of it, but it was a really important and good thing for me. The second book that I've chosen is Bill and Pete by Tommy DePaola, which is one of several children's books that I read. I read a lot of books over and over. Tommy and Bill and Pete, I'm sure I read many, many times. I had a particular place that I liked to read. It was sort of a very important part of my reading to be in that place. And sometimes I would read focusing a lot on the story, sometimes I would read focusing a lot on the images, and sometimes I would read focusing a lot on the words. It was a very different activity time to time. And I would often be discovering new things in books as I came back to them, having learned slightly more and being slightly better at reading. This book appealed to me because of its visual style and also the friendship at the center of it. I think I socially related to a lot. Next thing I've chosen is newspaper comics. Newspaper comics were really important to me. I read a lot of them, focusing particularly on Foxtrot, Calvin and Hobbes, and Dilbert. I think they also were things that I would read through, not quite get the joke, and so on multiple rereadings, I sort of understand them more and more. It's a lot of where I developed, I think, some of my social values was sort of what are the things that are normal and what are the things that are acceptable in sort of this world. And just sort of, and I just got to relate to the characters, and I wanted to sort of see them experience various things. I felt bad when characters were doing badly, and it was a very easy and simple world to engage myself in. And it also had that visual element to it, which was really helpful to me as an earlier reader. From picture books and comics, I eventually started reading chapter books. First, chapter books that had pictures in them, and eventually just chapter books. And one of the first ones that I remembered loving, and again, reading on repeat the way that I read a lot of the picture books and the way that I read the comics, was this one, Sideways Stories from Wayside School. It had a lot of that unfolding because the sort of surreality of it meant that a lot of times I wouldn't notice something was strange on my first reading, and I'd have to read it again to understand not just what had happened, but what was wrong with what had happened. It was also broken into small chunks that were very manageable, and I liked that a lot. It meant I could just read a little bit at one time rather than having to commit to the whole thing. It was funny, and I think it also made me feel very socially included. Like, the fact that it was sort of a weird school for weird kids just made it feel like a place that I wanted to be. And so it was a world that I committed myself to a lot. Then I started getting into series books, and the series that I was into were horror books that weren't Goosebumps. I decided very early that Goosebumps was too mainstream for me, and I needed to do stuff that was really scary. So I got into Strange Matter, got into Spine Tinglers, Bone Chillers. I think finding the books and looking, like, just because a lot of them went out of print very shortly after I got into them, and so it was always a challenge to find new ones, was part of the fun. But also, just the plot descriptions on the back got me really interested, and I wanted to know what was going to happen. And then a lot of the times I'd get really invested, but just knowing, being hooked by those plot descriptions on the back and that cover art and knowing what was going to happen was a huge part of it. And these series became a really large part of my social identity and were a thing that I read longer than I honestly care to admit. This was when I started to get into pop science books for a lot of reasons. They made me feel smart, and that was sort of something that was both socially and I think emotionally big for me. Was I liked feeling smart, but also I was just very curious. I wanted to know sort of what are the rules, what are the big things. A lot of them were above my reading level, but by sort of focusing and by using knowledge that I got from other of these books and from things I looked up in earlier books, I could follow along pretty well. Um, and they were just, at some point, I sort of almost became an embarrassing habit for me, but I love these books so much, and I learned a lot of sort of how to think scientifically and how to talk scientifically from them. At some point, I had to move on from the sort of kids series books that horror books that I was into, and so this became the first me trying to do adult horror. It's something that I just found on my parents' bookshelves. Um, and again, I was drawn in by the cover, and I was drawn in by the promise of the idea of adult horror. Like, what were the adults reading? I started reading it, and I quickly became really into H.P. Lovecraft. At first, it was sort of just the scary things, but then there were sort of some emotional elements that I connected to. A lot of the sort of like blurrings between fantasy and reality really interested me. And I just started to become interested in the way he used prose. He's one of the first people who I was really sort of noticing cool things about the way he was writing. And this was when I was starting to write myself, and I started trying to incorporate things from H.P. Lovecraft into my own writing to obviously greater or lesser success. Every once in a while, my parents would take me to Borders, and I would just look at various books there. Um, and occasionally they'd let me buy one. And one of the times I found The Count of Monte Cristo on a shelf. And honestly, it just looked so preposterously big that I was sort of that was the first thing that drew me to it. Was I'd just never seen a book that size. And then I started to read it, and I read the plot description, and I found that I could read it, which surprised me, but also it was engaging. And I was interested. And so I started reading it, and it was exciting. I mean, it's a very page-turning book. It's got a lot of suspense, characters fighting duels and things. And then I still remember all three of the revenges that the main character eventually gets. Sort of the first one is like feels sort of triumphant. The second one is sort of distressing, and the third one he forgives. And I love that happened, and it was one of the most sort of surprising and subverting endings to a book that I had come to yet. And it became really important to me. Then we come to Buzz, which is a book that I found in my high school library when I had a free period and didn't really have anything else to do. And I remembered when I found it that my dad had mentioned reading the same book at some point. And so I started reading it. And it's basically just a collection of interesting trivia and debunking myths about coffee and alcohol. Sort of the debunking myths was the main point, and then the interesting trivia is filling it out. But I really came to love the trivia aspect of it in a way that surprised me. So I think when I was reading like physics books, I wanted to understand sort of the rules of the world and sort of like what was underneath all the complexity. And then the trivia, I sort of learned to have fun with all of the weird, complex ways that things come together. And that was really exciting, and it's become a thing that I always try to have just a fun, neat trivia book with me at all times. And this was the first of those books, and it changed a lot about my approach to learning and to sort of what I thought was interesting. The last book that I've chosen is a book that I read in college. Um, by chance, I went to a public library and I found it, and I remembered having read a book by this same author in high school and hating it. And I decided, and I looked at it, and I read the first sentence, and it was beautiful, and I decided to give it a chance. And this was really the first time that I'd ever thought prose was beautiful and loved sort of just beautiful prose, and the sort of searing, very bittersweet sadness that the book had was absolutely wonderful to me. It was a really challenging book in a lot of ways. It has a lot of challenging ideas, and that became something that I valued, but just that I thought this was a book that was genuinely beautiful and that I was appreciating as a piece of art rather than as something to try and pull ideas from was something that really first happened with this book, Love in the Time of Cholera. Um, and that's become another big category in my reading. Currently, I always try to carry 3 books with me. One will be a fun sci-fi or horror book, one will be a trivia book, and one will be a book like this that I think is beautiful. And that is my current identity as a reader, and these are the books that I think most shaped that identity. Thank you.